Chapter 19. On the Mountain. It was now the summer of 1953. It was 14 years since my mother had made that brave but frightening journey by boat to England, and nearly 8 years since the end of the war. For the past 2 years she had been living with Wilfred and her 2 girls on the farm. Last September, Miranda had started going to school, and since then Mum spent every weekday utterly alone from the time we children left for school in the mornings until we returned home. She had no car and no means of getting into Swansea or even to the local village 5 miles away to do shopping or to make friends. While Miranda was at home, she had not felt quite so isolated, but now she spent her days doing chores around the house with only the radio for company, and out on the farm in deep silence. There was nobody to talk to except the 2 farm dogs, Goya and Tessa, except on a few occasions when she had to repel the advances of randy farmers who knew she was alone all day and thought their pretty neighbour fair game. This July day she washed the laundry, and as it was summertime and a fine day, she hung the washing out on the line to dry. There was a slight breeze, and she rested on the low stone wall at the front of the farmhouse, watching the clothes and sheets swaying in the sunshine. She enjoyed the smell of sun-dried laundry and the way the shadows of nearby trees appeared through the white cotton. She still had to feed the chickens and look after the new chicks that had arrived in boxes last week. They were already growing tiny feathers on their stunted little wings. Wilfred had decided to increase the number of hens on the farm, which meant more work for her, but could bring in a profit later if, as he claimed, there were people in his office who would happily buy fresh chickens and eggs from him. Not that she would ever see any of the money he got from them. She loved the cheapy little things, all soft and yellow, and tried not to think of the fate that awaited them. She went indoors into the kitchen and cut herself a couple of slices of coarse wholemeal bread. A new batch of dough was already rising under the tea towels at the side of the Rayburn stove, filling the living room with its yeasty aroma. The slices of bread were dry and hard, not as delicious as freshly baked, but nothing was wasted when you were trying to make ends meet. She spread the butter thickly and topped it with slices of cheddar. She took this simple lunch to the living-room table, where a book lay open. She switched on the 3rd programme for some music, and read while she took her lunch break, before getting down to all the other jobs that needed attending to before the girls arrived home from school. Sometimes the loneliness of her days felt unbearable. Sometimes the boredom of having no society all day long made the time alone seem longer than only 7 hours. Sometimes, although she knew that because they were living on a farm they had better food than most people living in towns, she wondered if it was worth the sacrifice. She looked down at her shabby, shapeless clothes and remembered the pleasure she used to take in being slim and looking good. She was glad that Hans Werner, or even Sonia, come to that, couldn't see her looking like this. All the confidence of being young and attractive seemed to have been drained out of her in this isolated place. She was nearing her 40th birthday. When she had had her last miscarriage, the doctor had suggested that she should give up trying for the son she'd hoped for. This had triggered her search for a baby boy to adopt. The council authorities had told her about several available babies, all unwanted by their mothers. Just like Hans and I were, poor little things. She and Wilfred had been invited to look at a baby boy in Cardiff, whose mother was syphilitic and was a patient in Whitchurch Mental Hospital. The baby had been born in October 1952. When they first saw him some months later, Ruth had loved him on sight, so arrangements had been made for the child to be brought to her in the summer. She thought about the coming child. He would be 10 months old when he arrived, a son for her and Wilfred, a little brother for her daughters. As she kneaded the dough at the living-room table, she sang to herself, recalling some of the old German nursery rhymes she had sung as a child. Now that the war was long over, it would not be so unpatriotic to teach the little boy some German songs. The thought brought a smile to her face. She hadn't told the girls yet, but today was the last day of the school year, and later in the summer holidays the baby would arrive. Today, after school, she would tell them all about their new baby brother. She placed the dough into loaf tins and set it to rise once more. It was nearly time for Chrissy and Miranda to return. Putting on her sun hat, for the day was hot and she had never been able to bear the heat well, she went out into the sunshine. Leaving the door of the farmhouse open to the glorious day, she called to the two dogs and walked them around the edge of the meadow under shady hedges of hazel, blackthorn and elder. The grasses were getting taller and soon would be harvested for winter feed for the cows. Hedgerows were filled with wild red campion, and foxgloves purpled the banks through a white haze of cow parsley. Beneath her feet the mossy ground was jewelled with sapphire speedwell, gold and amethyst vetches, and creeping clover. Mingling with the heady perfume of growing things were the more robust smells of farm animals. The dogs ran ahead, sniffing and exploring, panting in the heat. At the far corner of the field was a 5-barred gate that led out onto the mountain. From here she could step onto the rocky track leading to the road. She could see it snaking over the mountain nearly half a mile away. She was early, and there was no sign of the school car yet. She dreaded the hot walk down the farm track, where there was no shelter from the sun. It was just an unmade path of rough stones and sand about 5 feet wide. Today there were no puddles, only a lizard lazing on the hot granite rock. The dogs looked interested for a few moments, but the lizard quickly vanished beneath the stone, and the dogs disappeared into the bracken. She called them back. There was always a fear that when they got together they may worry sheep, and farmers were quick to use their shotguns on any dog that was a sheep worrier. She couldn't see many sheep, but she knew they were there. She could hear their occasional bleating. The bracken was high at this time of year, and the sheep liked to rest under the cooling green fronds. She arrived at the end of the track early and wandered down to the little bridge over the river. This was where the taxi turned around to return to the village. She slipped off her shoes and dipped her toes into the icy stream to cool her burning feet. Soon she heard the sound of the car. The last 3 passengers got out. Raymond from the neighbouring farm and her 2 little daughters. They all looked tired and sticky and smelled faintly of school. Miranda's face was flushed, and Christina had perspiration purling her forehead. The boy grunted a farewell and set off up the hill to his home, his leather satchel bumping uncomfortably against his side. "Hello, Mummy." "Hello, Kinder," children. "It's summer holiday time." The girls' faces brightened. They knew they wouldn't be going anywhere on holiday. They didn't expect to. The family couldn't afford it. But the long days of freedom stretched invitingly before them, and my mother was happy that for a few weeks at least she would have their company all day long. She took Miranda's hand. She knew the half-mile walk back to the farm was a long way for her tired little 5-year-old daughter. "We will go home and have a nice, cool drink," she told them, and hesitated, and then said, "And afterwards I have some exciting news to tell you." I'm puzzled as to how to write the story of the little boy who came to live with us as our brother a few weeks before my 10th birthday. He was 10 months old when he arrived, a beautiful baby with the bluest eyes I had ever seen. I suppose I was curious at first, watching Mum changing his nappies. After all, I was only familiar with girls' anatomy, and I dare say I found the difference interesting. Nicky was not his real birth name, but was the name we chose for him, as it seemed to suit him so well. Mum found bringing him up quite difficult in comparison to bringing up her daughters. What she was to discover before too long was that Nicky had a fearsome temper and could rage and scream for long stretches of time until Mum was at her wits' end. At length she gave up the hopeless task of trying to comfort him and popped him into his cot in the corner of her bedroom. "When you calm down, I will come to fetch you," she told him in the calmest voice she could muster, putting up the side of the cot and going downstairs. He screamed for about 2 minutes, and then, much to her surprise and relief, began humming to himself. This worked every time, and when he was old enough to talk, he would stop singing after a few minutes and call out, "Mummy, can I come down now?" From a very young age, Nicky could sing completely in tune. Perhaps it was his Welsh heritage. I'm amazed at how little else I remember about him. I suppose that by the time he came I had entered my bookworm stage and wasn't even interested in playing with Miranda, let alone a baby boy. But another thing that surprises me is that I can find very few photographs of him. There is one of him as a baby, sitting on a rug out in the garden with Miranda, and another with the whole family, on the occasion of one of Sonia's visits to the farm, when Nicky was about 3 or 4 years old, taken in the garden. He's wearing a cowboy hat. I know that Mum really wanted to adopt him, wanting to give a secure family life to the child who, like her, had been abandoned. But the health visitor advised her against it, as his natural mother's condition when she was carrying him could impact on his health as he grew up, even as late as his teenage years. She was told that it might not be good for her girls if Nicky developed mental problems later on. They also suggested, quite rightly, that she could really do with the financial help that they gave to foster carers. So she reluctantly took their advice and continued fostering Nicky instead. He loved the farm, and especially the animals, but I remember very little else about him. He was just there, our little brother, and since I no longer liked playing childish games, he was Miranda's companion in play more than mine. Although she spent much more time with him than I did, she too seems to recall very little about him. The clearest memory I have is of him standing up in his cot and singing his heart out with that beautiful, pure voice of his. Not long after Nicky came, I began preparing to take the 11+ exam, that, if I passed, would get me into grammar school. I was a keen pupil at the little village school and was eager to pass. I always enjoyed English, and although I didn't like arithmetic, I could do all the sums necessary to achieve the successful result I needed. I think that only 2 of us from Rhydyfrog School passed the exam that year. The other girl was Jennifer Jenkins, the daughter of a miner from the village, who was the cleverest girl in the school by far. Around the time that Nicky had been with us a year, I was kitted out with my first school uniform and became a pupil at Pontardawe Grammar School. From then on, there was little time to play, as every night I had homework to do. Where I found the peace and quiet to get it done I can't imagine, for the house was tiny and privacy was at a premium, especially with the 2 younger children around. Somehow I must have managed to find a space. By this time we had our first black and white television set, bought by my father at Mum's insistence, in time to watch the Queen's coronation, as so many families did at that time. As a toddler, Nicky enjoyed the fuzzy, slipping images of Bill and Ben the Flower Pot Men and Andy Pandy, but as he got older he preferred watching Champion the Wonder Horse and The Lone Ranger, which seemed to be a little boy's dream, hence the cowboy hat. My mother had the son she had longed for, and our family was complete. It was interesting that, unlike Miranda's arrival, I felt no jealousy when my little brother came to live with us. Perhaps I was too remote, too involved in my own world of school, books, and a new special friend to be unsettled by him. I was beginning to feel more independent and took to wandering on my own out on the mountain or down by the river, and sometimes even taking long, lonely walks to the 2-mile distant valley where my new best friend lived. Perhaps these are just excuses, just ways of letting myself off the hook. The puzzle remains. At that time, Nicky was just as important a member of our family as anyone else, so why do I remember so little about my brother? Memories of those times come to me in little snippets and not in chronological order. I have a picture of an earlier time in my mind's eye of a slim child going out through the big 5-barred gate behind the house. She wears a homemade summer dress and brown sandals on her feet. 2 flaxen plaits hang neatly behind each shoulder, each tied with a crisp blue and white check ribbon. She carries a heavy leather satchel containing an exercise book and an ink-stained pencil case filled with dipping pens, coloured pencils, a pencil sharpener, and a dirty rubber eraser. She steps eagerly down the path with thoughts of school and of homework well done. How old was I then? 8 perhaps, or 9 at most, I would guess. I'd left the farmhouse as usual to walk down the farm track to the school car. There was nothing out of the ordinary that morning, nothing to suggest that anything unusual was about to happen. Something that was scary at the time, but now, remembering it over 50 years later, feels more like a precious gift. The first part of the track was shaded on the farm side of the path by a high, dry stone wall where the purple foxgloves and a haphazard row of hazels grew, while high summer bracken on the rise of the mountain on the other side gave me the feeling that this part of the track was a green tunnel filled with soft smells of earth and sweet vegetation. On this particular day, the air was clean and damp after overnight rain, and the path still had the remnants of puddles, but the morning sparkled with sunshine and the promise of a hot summer's day. As I stepped out of the shade into the sunnier part of the track that crossed the side of the mountain towards the road, I became aware that today something was different. I couldn't think what it was for a few minutes. My eyes seemed to be playing tricks on me. All around me the air was shimmering with prisms of light. Everywhere I looked, the world was fragmented into rainbow shades. Nothing held its colour for more than a few seconds. Indigo and violet slipped into shards of green and red, shivered into gold and silver sparks. As I tried to focus on one colour, it mutated into another. Green summer bracken glittered orange and gold. Blue sky shimmered with dancing vermilion and purple specks. My walking slowed as I tried to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. It must be the end of a rainbow. But didn't they say you could never reach the end of a rainbow? What would happen to me if I did? Under my thin summer frock my skin prickled and my heartbeat hammered. Danger! Danger! I stopped. The school car was not yet in sight, but if I didn't carry on walking, I'd be late. I might miss it. I didn't want to miss school, but my legs refused to take me one step further through the splintered light of that rainbowed path. I turned and raced as fast as I could back to the farmhouse. Mum came to the door in surprise, looking worried when she saw my frightened face. Bent double with an agonizing stitch in my side, I gasped, "Mummy, Mummy, I can't go on. There's a rainbow on the path." "What do you mean, Chrissy? A rainbow? A rainbow couldn't hurt you." "No, I mean the whole mountain's a rainbow. It's blocking my way. I can't go. I can't go." She looked puzzled, but was, as always, gently reassuring. "Come, don't worry. I'll come with you. You'll miss the car if we don't hurry. I'm sure there's nothing to be frightened about at all." "But there is, Mummy, and I'm really scared to go through it." She walked with me then, holding my hand, all the way down the farm track, through that scintillating rainbow world, and all the way down to the now waiting car. "Do you see it, Mummy? Do you see it?" "Yes, Chrissy, it is very strange, but it is very wonderful too." As the car drove off, I looked back. She was standing, looking very alone at the roadside, waving to the departing car. I still felt slightly scared, rather shivery, and somehow seemed to sense enough about other children's mockery to know that perhaps I shouldn't tell anyone of my school friends. But when I got home from school that afternoon, I couldn't wait to ask Mum about it. "There was something funny on the mountain, wasn't there, Mummy?" She nodded. "Oh, yes, Chrissy. It was very strange, and I have never seen anything like it before in my life. I have to admit I felt a little bit nervous myself, walking back alone through all those shifting colours. The funny thing was that it all seemed to end at the farm gate. As an adult, I realise that a meteorologist could probably explain the phenomenon in scientific terms, some sort of chromatic polarisation due to weather conditions. But whatever it was something so unusual that I've never seen anything like it since. We both remembered it, and on rare occasions talked together about the day a rainbow came to our mountain. The mountains kept many secrets. I sensed them, the long history of earth and rocks through many millennia. There was one rock in particular that was very special to me. It can be seen on Google Earth, a large, almost square piece of lichen-stained granite, like a flat table on the path that leads up from the farm to the mountain. This was always a stopping place for me on my way to the top. The path was rough and steep, here and there crossed by a thin stream of spring water that fed our water supply. My special stone was situated at the perfect spot to rest and catch my breath after my eager scramble upwards. It was too tall for me to climb onto unless I clambered past it and approached it from above. Then I could sit on its smooth, sun-warmed surface and gaze over the fields and farm buildings below me. I could see my mother, Miranda and Nicky as tiny doll-like figures, busy in the yard or garden, and moving brown specks in the yard that I knew were our chickens, free-ranging between the sheds and duck pond. The rock was solid, stable, and sitting there I was conscious of the aeons it had witnessed. My imagination flew to earlier times, centuries earlier, when the farm had first been built out of rough local stones, and other people were mending walls, planting crops and tending their animals. Perhaps, I mused, some other child, centuries ago, had sat here looking down on the valley below. If I went down there now, would I find that time had switched back, and those people from long ago would be there? What would I say to them? After you are long gone, I will live in this place and love it too. Under my rock was a hole hidden by moss and thin, stringy grasses. It was large enough to put my arm in and not feel the end. Mum said it was probably a foxhole or badger set, but for me it was the entrance to a hidden world where, when I was very young, I believed elves and fairies had had their homes, and I was afraid that one day they might just come out and demand who it was who had the audacity to rest on their wonderful stone. Later, when I began reading children's adventure stories, the hole became the entrance to underground tunnels where criminals hid stolen treasures, and where, if only I had the same kind of courage as my heroes and heroines, my dog Goya and I would put an end to their wicked deeds. I was an imaginative but not very brave child. The top of the mountain was a vast undulating sea of breeze-tossed ochre grasses, moss and hidden marshes. Lying in the rough turf, gazing up into the endless sky, I watched a skylark, a black speck against the blue, flinging its song earthward to enchant me, the listening child. Beyond the birdsong I could hear the bleating of sheep and the low grumble of a distant tractor. Then I thought I could feel the thrumming of the earth's heartbeat beneath my body. The lark plummeted. Silence, absolute silence. Not a sound. No sheep, no tractor, not a breath of wind. I felt the presence of that silence, like a warm blanket, soft and all-embracing. I lay there, marvelling at my own place in the vastness of space and time. The world seemed to hold its breath. I began to feel smothered by the enormity of it. I became afraid. This was too much. I jumped up, looking in every direction for something to break the silence. Even Goya had disappeared, off on some doggy errand of her own. All I could hear was my own breathing. I turned and ran towards the horizon, pursued by fear, to the place where I knew I would feel comfortable again, the place where I would be able to see the farm. Once I reached that big grey rock, sides aching, I knew that I was safe from whatever it was out there that had scared me. My home was in sight. The world around me slipped back to being normal once again. I remember so many small details of our lives on the farm. We didn't have much money, and at the beginning there was still some rationing. But my father was a keen vegetable gardener, and we had eggs from our hens and ducks, and milk, butter, yoghurt, and cream supplied by our small herd of cows. Mum brought all her years of training in the Klinkovs' household to our modest table. She sometimes bemoaned the fact that she couldn't get hold of any garlic or red peppers, paprika, or some of her favourite herbs that were virtually unknown to British cookery at that time, but she could still turn our simple ingredients into memorable meals. As children, our tastes were unsophisticated, of course, and even a supper of fluffy boiled potatoes, cooked with more salt than was probably good for us, and al dente cabbage, smothered in home-churned butter with grated cheddar cheese melting over everything, could send us into raptures of appreciation. It tasted fresh and good, and was such a contrast to the dull school dinners of thin, tasteless gravy and overcooked vegetables. Every week Jenkins the grocer would bring, amongst other things, tins of pears and our favourite Kling peaches in heavy syrup. Mum kept them on the upper shelf of the dairy, together with her bottles of home-brewed elderflower champagne and Kilner jars of homemade elderberry soup, which we ate in winter, topped with butter-fried croutons. The wide stone benches below these shelves held huge white enamelled bowls into which fresh milk was strained and set to cool. After a while, thick yellow cream rose to the surface, and we'd skim off generous quantities of it to go with our peaches. What we didn't eat we turned into butter or cream cheese. There were days when the sound of cream swishing in our wooden butter churn was relentless. We all took it in turns, our hands becoming red with churning. At last, the sound inside changed to a gentle thudding, and we were all relieved that the job was done. The buttermilk was drained from the churn, and then Mum took out her wooden pats, pounding the salted butter into neat blocks, wrapping each one in greaseproof paper before storing them all in the dairy to keep cool. Nothing was wasted. The buttermilk went into baking or was fed to our pigs. Some milk would be left in a warm place to make yoghurt. Sometimes there were muslin bags dripping over bowls in the kitchen that, when eventually opened, revealed white cream cheese that Mum called quark, and which, as a child, I detested. Mum and Wilfrid had an arrangement that he gave her a fixed amount of housekeeping every week that was supposed to cover food and clothing purchases. It was never quite enough, in spite of the fact that Ruth did her own and our dressmaking. She had, over the years, discovered that it was almost impossible to get Wilfrid to acknowledge that sometimes extra money was needed for such things as new shoes for growing feet or fabric for dresses. He would become quite agitated at any mention of money. However, from her limited housekeeping, she scraped enough for the piano lessons for Miranda and me that she felt were an important part of our education. Mum was a tiny woman, barely 5 foot tall, and her tough work on the farm eventually impacted on her health. She had to go into hospital for a hernia operation. I can't remember how long she was away from us, at least 3 weeks, I think. She was sent to a convalescent home after she was discharged from hospital. They must have known that if she came home, she would start lifting heavy buckets of animal feed again. Apart from the pain of the operation and the separation from her children, she rather enjoyed being cared for and having some adult company other than Wilfrid's. In company she could become quite animated, and here at last was an opportunity for that side of her personality to express itself. I think I visited her once or twice. I just wonder who looked after us while our father visited her. I vaguely recall that meals were extremely boring while she was away, and I remember wondering how on earth we could cope if she never came back. In view of Wilfrid's lack of open-handedness with money, she was surprised when he asked her on one early visit if there was anything she would like him to bring her to hospital. She looked across the ward at the fruit bowl belonging to another patient that was brimming over with large, juicy grapes. "Oh, thank you, Wooshy." At that time she still called him by this affectionate name. "I'd love it if you would bring me some grapes next time you come." He brought her some, and although a little disappointed that they were tiny seed grapes rather than the gorgeous fat grapes the other patients had, at least she had some and was grateful. Every time he asked her what she would like, she would ask for more grapes, for they were a luxury that we rarely enjoyed. It was not until she got home from her convalescence that she found out that the fruit had not been a gift from him to his sick wife. Pinned to the kitchen door were bills for everything she owed Wilfred from her meagre housekeeping, and to her distress she saw that she was being charged for every gift of grapes she had happily consumed. She certainly wouldn't have asked for them if she had thought for one moment that she'd have to pay for them from her very limited resources. I think it was this that really brought home to me the true nature of my father's meanness. Even though I was young, I was disgusted, distressed at my mother's distress, and I knew that what he had done was unkind. It was many years later, when he was an old man, that I eventually realised that perhaps he couldn't help the way he was, and that there may have been factors at play of which we were unaware at the time. The air is fresh with grass-scented breezes, the sky above me a pale blue with high wisps of white clouds too thin to veil the sun. All around me I hear the humming of insects, drilling of grasshoppers, and the occasional bleat of a sheep. An invisible lark fills the world with its song. As I walk across the mountain, the Llyw Reservoir is a distant splash of blue to my left. The rest of the mountain top is nothing but springy turf, moss, and a shifting sea of pale ochre grasses. I'm 12 years old, and I'm going to visit my friend who lives over the mountain 2 miles distant from our farm. On my first day at Pontardawe Grammar School, we were given a test in the Welsh language. Each year had 2 classes, one was taught in Welsh and the other in English. Naturally, I found myself in the English class. Although I had had friends at junior school, I never felt they were completely on my wavelength. After a short time at my new school, however, I made friends with a girl called Glenys, who was, I think, in the year ahead of me. She was a Welsh speaker, but like me, she was a little different from the other girls. We soon found that we had interests in common. We neither of us liked sport or rough games, nor were we interested in boys or clothes like the other girls. We loved classical music, poetry, reading and writing. Every year the school put on an opera, and that year it was an English version of The Magic Flute, especially adapted for schools. We both loved it and adored singing the glorious melodies. Glenys sang soprano, and I sang the alto part. Our break times were spent sitting on the perimeter wall of the school behind a high shrubbery, well protected from those hated ball games. There we would discuss the books we were reading, music we liked, religion, about which we both had doubts at that time, and other worldly matters that are important to 12-year-olds, and we would tell each other stories of our own invention. But most of all, we loved to sing. I had found a kindred spirit. I had no idea where it was that Glenys lived. I knew it was even further away from Pontardawe than Lygos Farm was. Eventually, when I looked it up on my father's Ordnance Survey map of the area, I found that she lived to the northwest of our farm. By road it seemed a very long way, but over the mountain as the crow flies it was only about 2 miles. We arranged to visit each other. We could meet halfway. Such were the dips and gullies in the mountain top that we couldn't see each other until we were quite close. On some occasions I brought her to Lygos, and on others she took me to her house, Penarheol. One memory concerning Glenys stands out clearly in my mind. This is not really an essential part of my mother's story, rather it is part of mine, but in a way that's much the same thing. This time Mum had agreed that I can stay the night. I know the way quite well by now, but there are few landmarks and I misjudge the route. I find myself in a boggy area, jumping from one springy tuft of turf to another, hoping that I won't slip into the sucking ground between. For a while I feel scared. If I fall in, there is no one here to rescue me. I stand for a few moments looking around. I don't know how I didn't notice it before, but I'm standing inside a brighter patch of grass where cotton grasses grow and hidden pools of water are waiting to trap the unwary. I can see the edge of the bog a few yards to my right. Carefully, I negotiate the squelching marsh, icy water from underground springs seeping into my shoes until I'm on firmer ground. Then, finding a dry patch of grass, I sit down. My legs are feeling a little wobbly. I know what happens to creatures who wander into the bog. We've lost a calf and a cow that way. Soon I recover and am on my way again, this time skirting the dangerous area and heading to higher ground closer to the mound of stones that form the ancient earthworks of Penllyn Castell. I can see my goal now, another 20 minutes or so, and I should be there. Pen yr Heol is a stone cottage so small that it makes even the little Lygos house look spacious. The cottage stands at the head of the valley that leads down towards Garnswyllt, a couple of miles south of Ammanford. The house doesn't have any land other than a small garden. The floors are rough stone, and the dark, over-furnished living room is heated by an old black iron range where the fire never goes out. The range doubles as a hob, an oven, and clothes dryer. The room is stiflingly hot. There's no plumbing in the house. Everything seems very primitive, even to my unsophisticated eye. There are 5 people living in this tiny cottage. Glenys, her mother and father, her older sister, and her sister's red-haired baby boy. Her sister, Glenys tells me, is simple. Tup, she says, soft in the head. I am a little afraid of this simple-minded girl who has been taken advantage of by one of the local boys. But she won't tell. We don't know who's the father, Glenys said. We think we know. Not many round here with hair that colour, is it? But if she won't tell, there's nothing we can do. We don't hang around for long. Let's go for a walk down the valley. We'll visit some farms down the way. We link arms and sing at the top of our voices as we skip our way down the hill. The road is narrow, and we squeeze into the hedges and wave every time a tractor comes past. We visit one farm after another, getting a warm Welsh welcome in each. Let's go to that farm down by there. Old Grampy, who lives there, is a brilliant storyteller. Blind he is. We wander into a muddy farmyard, and an old woman wearing an enveloping floral apron welcomes us in with tea and biscuits. The house smells of coal dust. An old man sits beside the iron stove, his slippered feet resting on a rag rug. He's wrapped in crocheted shawls, in spite of the warmth of the evening. The woman, who looks old enough to be a grandmother herself, calls him Dada. He is almost blind, and peers at our shapes silhouetted against the light from the small window, his scrawny neck thrusting his head towards us like an ancient tortoise. Glenys Cariad, dear one, I recognise your voice, Bach, little one. His voice is as cracked as an old pottery cup. And who's this, then? Who's this come to visit an old man? Saesneg, is it? English? I feel shy at being in the presence of such an ancient man, and I've never met anyone blind before. I sit on the edge of a wooden chair and hug my mug of very sweet, very weak tea in cold, sweaty hands. Can you tell us one of your stories, Grampy, about that thing that happened here a long time ago? You know, Grampy, the ghost. Glenys gives me a look of encouragement. Please do, Mr. Thomas. I love listening to stories. Oh, well then, if you're sure you won't get too frightened. No nightmares now, mind. We both shake our heads. Look, you girls, and I'll tell you about a murder that happened in this very room years ago, he begins, and the haunting after that happens to this very day whenever there is a death coming to the house. We shiver in anticipation and settle ourselves a little closer to the fire. Dusk is gathering by the time the old man has finished his grisly tales, and we walk back up the hill to Glennis's house in semi-darkness, jumping at every rustle from the towering dark hedgerows, clutching at each other when bats swoop close above our heads. An unseen creature screeches from somewhere nearby in the gloom. Eventually we see the lights of the cottage before us and race the last few yards up the hill as if all the devils from hell are on our heels. After supper there's nothing to do. The downstairs room is far too stuffy for so many people. The baby is mewling in its basket, and the smell of ash and stew pervades the whole house. Unlike my home, there isn't even a radio. Glennis soon suggests we escape to her bedroom. One of the 2 rooms on the upper floor is her parents' room, and the other is for her sister and the baby. Where do you sleep? Up by here. Mind your head now. We climb up a ladder into a shallow space under the very eaves of the cottage. There's barely any headroom. There's no furniture, just a thin horsehair mattress piled with cushions and rough blankets on the wooden floorboards. There's just enough room for the 2 of us in the narrow space. Glennis settles herself next to the ladder, and I lie beside a tiny, uncurtained, floor-level window that looks out over the narrow road, now shrouded in night. If I sit up, I bang my head on the rough, sloping roof. This seems like an adventure, something the famous 5 would relish. Only I'm not one of the famous 5, and I don't like it one bit. While we're both awake, we giggle and talk as little girls do. But once silence and darkness settles into the night, I begin to feel that however much I love my friend, this is an experience I never want to repeat. As I listen to the softer breath of my sleeping friend, my eyes stray to the pitch-black night outside the window. I might have been out there, stuck in the bog, all alone in the darkness. It takes me a long time to get to sleep. The next morning, when it's time to get up, Glennis's mother puts a bowl of icy spring water outside the front of the house on a low table in full view of the road, together with a washcloth and a rough towel. There's a bar of green household soap on a broken saucer beside it, and absolutely no privacy. "Get yourselves washed now, Cariad." "It's freezing. Could I have some warm water in it, please?" She laughs at me. "Well, there's soft you are then. A bit of cold water never hurt anyone. Look at me, washed in cold water all my life I have. Now get on with it, girl. Breakfast is nearly ready." Breakfast is good. Thick slices of bacon and hunks of crusty white bread with butter, and more of the over-sweetened tea. After my freezing start to the day, it's good to have something warm and filling. Although Glennis and I remained friends, and I still visited her from time to time, I always found some excuse not to sleep over again. Our friendship began to feel the strain soon after her father died. Overnight she became very religious. She said she was outside their house at the moment when her father died, and believed that she saw his soul, in the form of a shaft of light, ascend to heaven. She knew I couldn't take this seriously. I suggested that as he died at sunset, the setting sun might have struck the glass of his bedroom window at just that moment. But she wouldn't have it, and I became irritated that from that day on she kept trying to convert me to Christianity. Not long after that, my father was offered a transfer, and we moved away. Glennis and I remained pen friends for several years after we moved. Her letters became more and more peculiar as time went on. She visited us in our new home in Surrey when she was about 15, but by then her behaviour had become very disturbing, and we could all see that whatever the affliction was that her Tup sister suffered from, something had also now deranged poor Glennis too. That was the end of our friendship. As a teenager, I couldn't cope with the changes in her, and our correspondence petered out. Many years later, when I was married and living in London, I went into the Woolworths store on the busy Kilburn High Street and saw Glennis again. She was serving behind the confectionery counter and had a strangely vacant expression on her face. I wondered what she was doing so far from home, but I left quickly before she could recognise me. feeling a bit guilty, but not willing to renew the childhood friendship that had given me so much joy, but ended on such an uncomfortable note.